Let me start with a simple yes or no question. Is it fair to say that you both like to travel and explore the world?
Yes.
Yes.
But do you think travel can be compatible with our current climate crisis?
Yes.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, certainly seeing new things can be compatible with the climate crisis.
Welcome. This is On Thin Ice, a podcast by Iceworm Media in partnership with the Bally Peak Outlook Foundation. We bring together big thinkers, adventurers, scientists and entrepreneurs to look at what can actually be done today to accelerate the transition to a more sustainable economy and lifestyle. I'm your host, Paolo Bosonin, and I'm excited to be joined by two exceptional guests. Alex Honnold, who woke up early to join us from Las Vegas. He's one of the world's best-known climbers who rose to stardom with the Oscar-winning documentary film titled Free Solo. But Alex is also very active on the climate front. He runs a foundation advancing solar energy around the world, and a bunch of other things. Welcome to Thin Ice, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
And here in Iceland with me, Nanna Baldvinsdottir. Nanna is widely seen as a pragmatic climate entrepreneur with decades of experience in the energy sector, with a particular focus on hydrogen. She's been a prominent voice in Iceland's energy transition, and I think she was one of the first to strike a big commercial deal with an airline, Icelandic, to provide airplanes with more sustainable fuels. Thanks for meeting us in Reykjavik, Nanna.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So let's dive in. Our main question, or some would call it a contradiction, is one that many of us have on our minds these days. If you care about the environment, how do you feel about taking planes to travel around? And I'd like to ask both of you, how many flights do you take every year, and how important is it for you to be able to travel?
I travel a lot, and my family is in aviation, and we often joke that building this e-SAF facility is like it's our only hope to actually negate our own emissions, but clearly that's a joke. But yes, I travel a lot and I would like to be able to do that in a more sustainable manner.
And just a note for our listeners, e-SAF is sustainable aviation fuel made with electricity. We'll get back to this in just a second, but how about you, Alex? How much do you travel?
Yeah, I also fly more than average for sure. Maybe less than people might think. But I would say that travel and sort of adventure travel isn't always by airplane, just because depending where you live in the world, there are a lot of ways to travel and adventure that don't require a plane. But so I think when we talk about sustainable travel, I mean, obviously aviation is the big thing. But I mean, I did a 2-month expedition this summer by bicycle. And so you're kind of like, well, that's, there's a lot of traveling and a lot of adventure, but with only the return flight home at the end.
So you may have managed to kind of reduce your carbon footprint by half.
Yeah, exactly. Except that, when you really get down to the accounting, it's actually way worse because it was a TV show. And so then there are all these other people involved. And so then instead of being just a simple bicycle trip, they're actually, a crew of 8 flying to various places. And you're like, oh, geez. But then you come back to the other side where you're like, well, it's still a way lower impact than a lot of other TV would be. Just, the nature of that kind of like adventure content is totally different than like the Kardashians going to Europe or something. You know what I mean? It's like, anyway, I would say that calculating the emissions of all that is complicated.
Well, and then you also need 2 months, which is a long time, and not many people have that.
Yeah, though in some ways, I think that's what makes some sorts of travel or adventure. When we get into how much we fly, in some ways, I think I fly less than people might expect, just because if I do a climbing expedition or a trip, it's generally for a month or more. So like if you're going somewhere, you go for 6 weeks, and sort of by definition, you wind up flying less that way because you stay places for a long time.
So here's a question for both of you. Do you keep track of exactly how many flights you take every year? And is there anything you do to specifically offset that?
I do not. I do not keep track of my flights. I'm perhaps a bit embarrassed to say, but I work day and night on making aviation more sustainable. But no, I do not. I think when offsetting was an option, like when it first came out as an option, I remember Icelandair started offering it maybe, I want to say 2007 or 2008. I remember I did it a few times, but then there's been so much gray, negative press, I think, about offsetting that I stopped doing that. And put my focus on, meaningful solutions instead, and really just what can we do about making aviation more sustainable.
Alex?
So I don't specifically keep track of my flights anymore. So when I first started the Honnold Foundation, I actually did some sort of back of the envelope math about uh, the emissions from my total flights of the year, and back then was actually still relatively similar to what I'm doing now because I was on more climbing trips. So I was like traveling, so sometimes I was abroad for maybe 6 months of the year, though those trips were like one continuous long trip. So it's not like tons of different flights. It's actually sort of like one flight to the Middle East and then a bunch of little, then a month in Greece and then a month in Turkey and then a month in Israel and Jordan. And, so it's not like a crazy amount of flying, but it is a fair amount. But so back then I did sort of some rough math as to how many, the total emissions for a year of travel like that. And at the time I found that one home PV, like one home solar system, the life, and I did all this math for California, which is where I was living at the time. But I put solar on my mom's house. I put solar on some of her like less fortunate neighbors' homes and things like that. Just random. I was kind of just like at an individual level putting solar on people's houses, and I found that the lifetime system offset was similar to 1 year of travel for me. So I was kind of like, oh well, there's some simple math for me that if as long as I'm sorting out like one family or friend or neighbor or something a year, it's like roughly in line with my year of travel, which I thought was like, oh, this is great. And then the Honnold Foundation is now doing something similar at a much bigger level with communities in greater need. And, basically everything about the work that the Honnold Foundation does is better than that. But it was enough for me to know that the basic math kind of works and that the idea, at least I can sleep well knowing that, I'm probably doing more good than harm climate-wise.
So it's sort of a balance sheet, and you can be in the green or in the red, and you try to stay in the green, right?
Yeah, that's kind of how I think about it.
Sounds like a solar angel.
I don't know about that. But I mean, until there are more sustainable options for flying, I mean, really the only option is offsetting in some way, or at least like mitigating in some way, trying to do more good than harm. I also looked at offsets at the time and then decided that it was better to spend the money more intentionally. Because really, when you put money into offsets, you're basically paying somebody to do some kind of project, to have some kind of positive impact in the world. And I would prefer to just choose the impact directly myself and the things that I think are best, basically.
Well, for people who can't do that, there certainly are more options these days to arguably buy your way into lowering emissions, right? Just to name a couple, there are companies selling carbon credits or others selling packages to go do volunteering work with communities affected by climate change. What do you think about those?
That kind of stuff, though, you're kind of like, oh, if you're flying to the middle of nowhere to go like help somebody in a village, you're much better off wiring the people in that village some money and letting them do the work themselves than you flying there. I mean, and that's something that we see frequently with the work that the Honnold Foundation does, is that we're basically a grant giving organization supporting community organizations around the world. So we're basically sending money to people to implement the projects that they think are most useful for their community. And all the time we get people offering to volunteer because they basically want to fly to exotic places and like help people. And while I commend the spirit of it, it's like, oh, at least people are trying to help, and that's commendable. That's great. I'm like, really, you want to go on an exotic vacation to help climate change? And you're like, that's just obviously not the way. That's, it's like, if you want to help, send people money so that they can do the work themselves.
Ultimately, the core issue is that transportation, moving things and people around, pollutes a lot. Aviation makes more than 2% of global carbon emissions, and it's a huge user of fossil fuels, which produce about 3/4 of climate heating carbon emissions. And a big problem for planes is that they actually emit gases pretty high into the atmosphere, meaning they have a greater warming effect. And probably the biggest issue in all this is speed. Even though governments and companies broadly agree that there's an urgency to act, any action to reduce this impact is slow. For example, Airbus, the plane maker, is talking about hydrogen planes maybe in 2050, which is a very long time, whereas record temperatures, natural disasters are all happening right now, and glaciers here in Iceland and elsewhere are melting faster and faster. So, Nanna, let me bring you in here, as the question of speed is at the center of your project as an entrepreneur. You're developing something called sustainable aviation fuel. Can you tell us first what that is, and also why do you think it's an important solution?
Yeah. So sustainable aviation fuels, it's a group, a category of fuels that we can make through several different processes that are usable on today's airplanes and today's infrastructure. So what we're doing on our project, my company, H2, which is a hydrogen development company here in Iceland, we are producing, or will be producing hydrogen, synthesizing that hydrogen with CO2, either from the atmosphere or from a point source, an industrial source, to make Jet A1, to make kerosene, but without the carbon content because it's reused CO2. It's not fossil fuel from the ground. And that allows us to significantly reduce the carbon content in a fuel that is otherwise exactly the same as regular Jet A1. That's what we use on airplanes today. So the product that we're making is chemically, it looks just like Jet A1, which is why you can use it on regular airplanes. I mean, granted, it has to be tested. And this allows us to really maintain fueling infrastructure from the tank into the airplane. We don't have to make any changes there. The only changes that we have to make in our particular project is just in how the fuel is made.
And is that technology ready?
The technology most certainly is ready. There's like 5 or 6 modules that you're putting together, and all of them are, have been used commercially, but it hasn't been done at this scale before. We're making a 300 megawatt project. Projects like this, they've been done at the 30 to 40 megawatt scale. Yes, they're expensive. And yes, we know that on paper, it most certainly can be made 10 times bigger. It just hasn't been done before. That's why it's like new technology, but kind of a new application of a series of established technologies. So right now, you can use sustainable aviation fuels for up to 50%, a 50% blend with traditional kerosene on today's airplanes. But we've seen with recent news that, you can use 100% sustainable aviation fuel on these flights. It hasn't been approved by the regulating body for more than 50%. But this is, even though it's more expensive to produce sustainable aviation fuel, it's still kind of a low-hanging fruit in the whole scheme of where we have the sort of best business cases for drop-in fuels, which maybe feels a little bit strange, I think, maybe to people outside the energy industry. But like our situation is, we have a site where we can produce a whole bunch of hydrogen, and we can do it for very, very, very cheap because we're here in Iceland where it's all renewable power and it's inexpensive power. And we're blessed to be located next to Iceland's international airport. So if we can just synthesize this hydrogen with CO2, then we don't have to deal with any of the distribution problems. We can just blend it right on site and just put it directly into the pipeline that goes up to the airport, and boom, drastic reductions in CO2.
Where do you guys get the hydrogen or the CO2?
So the hydrogen we make
from separating water?
Yeah, sustainable water, which is sustainably sourced.
What, is sustainable water just water? It's just a joke, because especially somewhere like Iceland where it rains and snows a ton.
Coming right out of Vegas there, there's definitely sustainability issues with water all over the world. So a lot of these projects from Northern Africa, you desalinate water. Are you going to be then piping water past agriculture? Are you going to be piping water past people that need water to put into airplanes? I mean, there's all kinds of sustainability issues with water. We have to be very, very mindful to not be taking water where we should not be taking water. And in Iceland, we happen to be quite lucky as far as the availability of water.
And what about the CO2?
CO2 is trickier because now the EU has put on, so there's a blending requirement. So now from 2025, all flights taking off from EU airports have to have a certain amount of sustainable aviation fuel in the tank. So that's the new rule. And they are the ones that set the rules for what sustainable aviation fuel is and how it can be made. And now the EU has said that after the year 2041, all CO2 used in these synthetic fuels that are put into planes, all the CO2 has to come from a biogenic source. The biogenic cycle versus from industrial emissions. So they don't want any fossil. They don't want to set up any value chains now because you build these projects and you want them to run for 30 years. Nobody's building this type of project to not run it after 2041. Everyone now is sort of scrambling to try to get biogenic CO2. And biogenic CO2 you have to get from paper pulp. You have to get it from some sort of agricultural process. I'm sorry to lots of projects that had a fossil source and are sort of scrambling now. It's definitely been challenging for a lot of projects, I know, but I understand what they're doing. They don't want to set up these systems where you're creating more uses and more excuses and more reasons to continue using fossil fuels. It doesn't make any difference to the quality of the fuel or the safety of the fuel or anything like that, but it just means that the source is much more sustainable.
Nanna, you're saying it can be tricky to find the resources to produce sustainable fuels in general and biofuels in general. Whether it's water or feedstock, you don't want to divert crops from agriculture, which could end up pushing up food prices, for instance. So how can you make sure your fuel is made in a truly sustainable manner?
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is just, that's just biofuels just are a huge group of fuels, and some of them are not made in a sustainable way and others are. The reason why e-SAF, so anything that's hydrogen-based, sustainable aviation fuel that's hydrogen-based is called e-SAF. E is for electricity. And the reason why the EU, they put a sub-requirement on e-SAF, that is because when you make sustainable aviation fuel from hydrogen and recycled carbon, no competition with food and fodder, much lower land use, so much easier to track and trace. So we'll know where our power comes from. We'll know exactly where our water comes from. We'll know exactly where our biogenic CO2 comes from. And it'll be much easier for us to show that we're not disrupting other natural cycles.
Where will biogenic CO2 come from in Iceland?
That's like our biggest problem that we have to solve.
That's the crux, huh?
You're right. Biogenic CO2, it's not sourceable in Iceland.
And just a quick note that biogenic CO2 comes from biomass. Sometimes it can be from wood that's burnt or from organic waste that releases carbon when it decomposes, for example.
Alice has been to Iceland for long enough to know that not a lot grows here.
Yeah, the one day I spent in Reykjavik was enough to see that there's not a huge source of...
Yes, we do not have giant paper mills or huge agricultural...
Or really plants of any kind.
Well... Watch it now.
Well, it's getting warmer. I guess more stuff can grow.
Right. Well, geez, that's just so sad to think about. But we will probably have to import it. If we don't import it, there is a chance that we'd be able to source it from a waste incineration facility that's being built. So we have to know. Iceland has been, landfilling our trash for generations. And I guess the time has come that we have to build a waste incineration facility. And I would like very much for that one to be placed for the entire country right next to us. I'd like for it to be by the international airport because we can take all those emissions and we can put it directly up into our airplanes.
Now, back to the question of speed. Sustainable aviation fuels are getting support from institutions. The IATA, the aviation industry body, even says SAF could contribute as much as 65% of the emissions reduction needed to reach net zero in 2050. But again, we're just seeing the first test flights. Just recently, Gulfstream and Virgin Atlantic both publicized that they'd completed transatlantic flights powered fully by SAF. But how long will it take before this is widely adopted? And what's your timeline, Nanna?
Well, I think that the energy transition onto actual net zero for aviation is tough because it's a little ways out. Batteries, yeah, we can fly short distances. The first pure hydrogen flight, yes, we've seen that happen, but these planes are small and they're not taking us over oceans yet. And we are some years away from being able to do that. The reason why the aviation sector in general, and I think policymakers in the world are starting to realize sustainable aviation fuel, doing a fuel switch in existing aircraft, that is really going to be our best bet for making meaningful decarbonization steps now. For us, our timeline, if everything goes to plan, we can start operating by year-end 2027. And that is because we have to bring carbon to the site. We have to build the thing. We have to build new power generation for this facility. We'll have to get, hopefully, a waste plant next door to us. Otherwise, we'll have to import from mainland Europe somewhere. So these are all the long timeline things, is that you have, even though we are selling to a user that does not need to make any infrastructure changes themselves, we still have lots of heavy long-term capital investments that have to be, carefully engineered and carefully planned in order to make this happen. And this takes time. So I'd say that's an optimistic timeline to be ready at year-end 2027.
Well, one thing you know is that starting in 2028, you have a commitment from a big client because Icelandair has announced that it will purchase 45,000 tons of the fuel that you will be producing. Still, I understand that financing at this stage isn't exactly easy to get, right? So how are you getting the funding you need?
Well, yes, it's hard to finance these projects for anyone, even big companies. It's hard to finance these projects. For us, we've been okay up till now. We've been able to get all the project concept, the project planning, and able to do that. Now we're sort of at a stage where we need to get bigger money in because all the phases that are ahead of us now are expensive. So just the front end engineering on a project like this can cost upwards of $10 million. And because I'm not a Rockefeller, I don't have the friends and family network for that type of money. So that's really sort of where we're at now, is getting a hold of those bigger checks in order to get to the next phase of development. There's a commonly known sort of valley of death for projects like this, where you can move very, very swiftly in the early stages, and you know what has to get done in order to be able to talk to banks, to be able to talk to institutional funds. Unfortunately, those steps in between the friends and family stage and the institutional funding stage, that's where we're seeing a lot of projects sort of going sideways. So there's definitely a need for funding. And those projects are getting support in many countries. So the Danish government is doing a wonderful job. Norway, Germany, there are countries that recognize this problem and are putting public funding in to projects during that sort of valley of death stage. We haven't seen that in Iceland yet, but could happen. But yeah, we're seeing that everywhere. I follow this market, obviously, and it's a real shame because some of these projects I know would have been great projects, but are sort of having a difficult time finding funding at that infamous valley of death stage.
Why do you think it's still hard to find money for innovation in climate tech more generally? And I'd like to open the question to both of you. Alex, is it complicated to get funding for your foundation as well?
Well, I think in general, it's hard to find money for philanthropy because you're just asking somebody to give you something for nothing. I mean, realistically, it's probably easier to fund, fossil fuel related startup activity than philanthropic projects, just because ultimately, what you're talking about will probably make money at some point. So it's like somebody is going to see the value in that. But I think, the nature of philanthropy is that you're giving things away. So it's always a bit of an uphill battle to find funders. I mean, in the US anyway, climate philanthropy represents a tiny fraction of philanthropy more broadly. So when you talk about environmental projects and climate related philanthropy, it's like under 2% of what people are giving for. And I mean, and most people that are, philanthropic in the US anyway, are basically giving to their alma mater, like giving to their university, giving to the symphony. It's like they're basically supporting their own hobbies and their own interests. It's like hardly anybody supports philanthropy that's actually for the greatest public common good. People are like supporting the things that they think are cool. Like, oh, I love the symphony and I want to go next season. Like, we should probably give. You're kind of like, is that real philanthropy? Like, is that helping the people that need it the most? It's like great to support the arts, but I just don't know if you can consider that in the same category as, climate justice sort of things. The Honnold Foundation supports community solar projects around the world. So the projects vary in size and scope, but basically small scale sort of grassroots organizations using solar for the betterment of their community in whatever way. So sometimes that just means simple grid tied systems where they're just saving money for a school, let's say. Sometimes that means super rural off grid where they're using power for refrigeration or for agricultural projects, for whatever. I mean, there's this huge pipeline of projects. We have an open call for grants every year and we get hundreds of applications. And the last couple of years, we've given 2 million in grants or so, which is like a tiny fraction of the applications we get. But so it means that we have to be pretty selective about the projects we choose. So we're choosing the ones that are the most sort of win-win-win, where you're like, oh, wow, that's, a good application for solar. It's like great for the community. It's like helping, indigenous girls in the right place. And you're just like, oh, this is, the kind of things where you're like, wow, that is incredible. Like, why isn't somebody funding that? Because there's sort of a dearth of funding in this space. It means that we get to choose the very best projects. But realistically, we should be choosing like most of the projects, because like they don't have to be perfect. Like, I wish we could fund far more, but it's obviously hard to find people that support that kind of work.
And Nanna, can a startup like yours be a profitable commercial venture these days?
Well, we are producing a product that, the cost of production is 3 to 4, maybe 5 times greater than the price of conventional kerosene. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely, we're always competing with a cheap and reliable product, which is from fossil fuel. I mean, the reason why we have a fossil fuel global economy is because oil is cheap and it's easy to move around. Moving into this hydrogen space, like hydrogen is much more, you can make it cheaply, but it's really complicated to move. It's leaky and it's a challenge to move around. But this is the job of governments, exactly. So the reason why, I commend you, Alex, it's just incredible to be supporting solar development in that way. But, the reason why solar panels are as inexpensive as they are today is because there was lots of government subsidies years ago, right? So governments stepped in and realized that if they helped this industry along, then we would eventually reach a point where we would have much less expensive solar panels. And that's exactly what has to happen with renewable fuels. So if we had, and we do have in many parts of the world, serious government intervention in recognizing that the price differential between traditional fossil fuels and clean renewable fuels needs to be reduced. So we need to make the price of fossil fuels, of course, more reflective of the environmental damage that they cause. And also, while at the same time, we need to be supporting those that are early movers, innovators, taking the risk that will eventually lead to, certainly not my facility is not going to be the cheapest in the world, but hopefully the fourth or fifth or 10th one after that, we're going to be seeing that the same type of technological advancement that we saw in solar panels hopefully happen in renewable fuels. So we've seen this happen before. We know exactly what has to be done. And I'm optimistic that we'll see that happening.
Well, politically, it's obviously been tricky for governments to invest in a greener economy. A lot of jobs around the world still depend on fossil fuels. But do you think that's changing?
I think that there's recognition of this, certainly in the EU, and we've certainly seen recently in the US where there's been finally some meaningful climate action and some money going into hydrogen projects and renewable fuel projects, which is wonderful to see. So hopefully we're going to see that start to happen, because no entrepreneur wants to develop a project that's reliant on government funding. That's just like, nobody wants to do that. You want to just be making a product that people want and is just made incredibly efficiently and is fit for purpose. But unfortunately, the economics are such that those projects do need help. And it's not even help. Governments need to recognize that those projects need to be fostered, knowing that the next project will be cheaper and the one after that will be even cheaper.
Though, as you were saying, I mean, if the real price of fossil fuels reflected their full environmental cost, then you don't really need the government stewardship. You don't need the support. It's like, in some ways, if it was a slightly more even playing field,
I mean, fossil fuels are heavily subsidized still globally. So it's not like the fossil fuel price is somehow just completely natural, all demand and supply. Fossil fuel production is heavily subsidized. It still is.
And heavily subsidized at every step along the way. Like from the extraction, from distribution to the refinement, every step is heavily, it's crazy.
Well, it's very difficult, because if you let the price of fossil fuels go up when there is no viable alternative, you're not getting reelected. And we've seen, that's been happening since the 70s, especially in the US. That's like so incredibly important. Like, what's the price of gas if you're going in for your second term as president? So it's really a challenging conundrum, I think, for politicians, even the ones that want to actually, take meaningful climate action. If there are price shocks in fossil fuels and people don't have an alternative, then it can be very, very devastating to economies, and it can be really, really difficult for poor people.
Alex, things have certainly been moving a bit with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, or even COP28 talking about moving away from fossil fuels for the first time. So do you think a shift is now underway?
I don't think we're seeing that big of a shift yet. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is incredible. And actually, I was on an expedition in Greenland when that was passed, and we came out from 6 weeks of basically no contact in remote Eastern Greenland. And we came out and we're like, what's happening in the world? And I read about the Inflation Reduction Act, and I was like, holy shit, how long were we gone? What happened? How did that, because you go into the mountains with no idea that the US could ever pass meaningful sort of climate leadership, sort of project. And then you come out and you're like, wow, have we been gone for 2 years? And it actually felt like we were gone that long, because it was a pretty rugged trip. But no, I think despite the efforts that the US is making, it doesn't feel any different. I mean, certainly, what you hear in the news, what you hear talking to people, it all feels about the same, where nobody really cares. But what I actually think is going to be the bigger difference in the US is just the faster adoption of renewables and the faster transition towards electric vehicles. Because I think that's when people stop conflating the price of gas with the general health of the economy, or with election or whatever else. Because it's like, once everybody's driving electric, and I'm sort of seeing that amongst many of our friends, where most people have, say, one electric car and then one sort of like long range commute. The whole idea around electric transit in the US is a little bit different because the distances are so vast, particularly where we live, where it's literally hundreds of miles to the closest next city. But, it's like basically once you transition to electric, it's hard to go back to fossil fuels. I think a good push would help it happen faster and would probably help prevent, hopefully, the worst effects of climate change. But I mean, either way, all forecasts are to 100% renewables and sort of 100% electric by 2050, let's say. It just would be better if it was sooner.
I actually wanted to ask you about Greenland, Alex. While I was preparing this episode, I saw that it wasn't just a climbing trip, but you were traveling with scientists and helping them to do some research. Can you tell us what you did over there? And also, is that part of your process now, kind of adding specific goals and purpose beyond the athletic feat and the expedition itself?
I mean, I guess the way I look at it is that if you're going to go climbing in a remote location, it often makes sense to have a scientist or somebody knowledgeable along with you to sort of take advantage of that kind of trip. And I've done a couple different trips this way now where you have one member of the team who's a scientist doing legitimate research in that place, because as it turns out, like many things in human society, basic science is wildly underfunded. And so there are a lot of places that if a scientist can just get there and spend some time with their instruments doing their thing, they can get meaningful data. And so I did an expedition into the jungle in Guyana going climbing with this biologist. And we were there for a month. He discovered 6 new species to science in the month. And I mean, basically that trip opened my eyes to the fact that with relatively few inputs, you can have a pretty good impact. You're sort of like, oh, all it takes is getting the right person to the right place for some time to do his thing, and we can discover new things for humanity. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing because you think that science is so advanced, but you're like, the reality is that there are a lot of places that are hard to get on Earth. And if you're going there, you should take somebody who can take advantage of it. So this trip to Greenland, we brought a climate scientist, glaciologist. Actually, one of my friends described it as sort of analogous to people on the International Space Station, where it's like you have one astronaut basically doing projects for universities across the entire world. And that's basically what she was doing. She was kind of running experiments for maybe a dozen different universities around. Heidi Sylvester is the name of the glaciologist. She's French, and she was amazing and super charismatic and super knowledgeable. But every day she would have all of her little instruments open and like reading PDFs and trying to figure out how to execute all the plans for these different universities. But she was basically just collecting data for other people for all the projects that they're working on.
And do you think these projects you're doing reflect a broader mindset change for climbers and mountaineers compared, say, to the 50s and 60s, where the goal was to conquer peaks for the first time?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so actually there is kind of a rich history of this type of scientific inquiry on expeditions. Sort of classical expeditions like in the 1800s almost always had a geologist and a botanist and people, taking flower pressings and rock samples and bringing things back. And so, I mean, there's always been that curiosity around discovery. You're right, though, that mountaineering of the 1950s and 60s became slightly more nationalist and more about, conquering a peak and showing, national pride and, achievement and whatever else. But I think that with modern climbing, there is a much greater awareness around the fragility of the planet. And so you just wind up with a slightly greater obligation to try to do something useful for the planet, whether that's scientific inquiry or sort of humanitarian efforts like helping communities that you visit along the way or whatever else. I just think that in the modern world, everybody knows that there are issues that maybe should be helped with, basically there's a lot to be done. And so I think that as a modern climber, you feel a certain obligation to do something.
So what's your next big thing?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, so the trip to Greenland that we're talking about will be a TV show on National Geographic, but that was a year and a half ago. And then this summer we did an expedition to Alaska, which had sort of a similar idea to it. We were sort of exploring the forests in Southeast Alaska. It's like the largest temperate rainforest in the world. For now, though, actually, my wife is having a second child, or we're having another child soon. So basically, we're just at home waiting for baby number 2 to come.
Wow, congratulations! That's a huge project.
Yeah. So no big expeditions for a while, I don't think.
It's almost time to wrap up, and I'd like to get your thoughts on one more thing. Why do we, as humans, feel this need to travel, and do we really need to continue to do that? Nanna, why is it so important for you to continue to travel?
One of the reasons why I am doing what I'm doing, and I've, had the career that I've been blessed to have, is because of travel. It's because of growing up in two places, growing up both in the US and in Iceland. I don't want to sound corny, but just connecting with people that have a different experience and that grew up in different cultures and spoke different languages and all the wonders that this world has to offer. It motivates me to action, and I know that it motivates others to action as well. So I think that it's really important to me. I get an emotional connection to the thought of being able to fly sustainably. I think it's also important to keep understanding why other areas of the world are important. And I think that the best way to do that is through travel.
Alex, do you also feel that call for action when you travel and visit other places and meet other people?
Though going to Greenland, you have very few cultural interactions compared to traveling other places because there were no people where we were going. It's like the most remote landscape, in the world practically. But no, I mean, I totally agree that a lot of what I know about the world is because of travel and just interacting with other cultures, like seeing other landscapes and just experiencing the world around me. And I'd say that much of the reason that I care about the world around me is because of having traveled. Talking about sustainable travel, though, there's one thing that I'd maybe add is that, I travel for climbing, which is also work, and I'll travel for work, like events and things. But I don't know if I've ever traveled for personal things, like, my friend's birthday or like a concert or whatever else. Part of that's because my work is quite enjoyable. And so traveling for work is like easy and chill, and I get enough of it. But I basically never fly for, family things or like vacations or because I kind of get enough of community and fun through my work travel. I have a lot of friends that are like, oh, I'm going to Denver for a concert. And I'm like, why? We live in Las Vegas. There are a lot of concerts here. It's like you can just drive down to the strip. Heck, you could bicycle down to the strip and see a concert. Like, why the heck would you fly to wherever? Or like your friend's bachelorette party in like some exotic location. You're like, why? And I know it's easier for me to say that because like I do the thing I love to do all the time at home. Like going climbing is amazing. I live in an amazing destination for climbing. And so it's easy to be very content with my life and not feel like I need to travel and see people in different places. But, for people trying to cut down on flights, like that's the easy place to start. Like, oh, it's my uncle's birthday. You're like, FaceTime him. It's like, who cares? Like, you don't have to fly.
Well, as a society as a whole, it's really hard to know if and how we will be able to reduce our emissions. For now, the data don't look good. Just to give you one number I have here, the United Nations says we need to cut emissions from tourism by 50%, but the industry's emissions are actually forecast to grow by 25% by 2030 compared to 2016 levels. So we're not on course at all. At the same time, there are some positive indicators. We were talking about investment, and it's a fact that there has never been nearly as much investment in clean energy technologies globally. So my final question is, would you bet that we will manage to reduce our emissions from travel or not?
I think that short term, I'm incredibly pessimistic. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to be seeing terrible, terrible climate disasters, even worse than the ones that we've been seeing in recent years, which are heartbreaking. But I think that all of the technology is available today for a net zero society. And I don't think I would have said that 2 years ago. But today, Iceland, 350,000 people and fairly wealthy, and we could, in theory, decide to just put everything full blast to go net zero within 5 years. It's possible. It's totally possible, which I don't think is going to happen. I think that in the short term, we're going to continue to see emissions rise. We're going to continue to see unsustainable tourism grow, terrible climate disasters that are going to affect marginalized and poor people worse, and women. And that makes me very sad. But I think that long term, we will, 10, 15, 20 years out, we're going to learn the hard way that these decisions need to be made, and that we have to actually walk the walk instead of just talking the talk, which I see too much of today.
I roughly agree with Nanna on that. I mean, I'd say by nature I'm a pretty optimistic person, and so I generally believe in human progress. But I would take what Nanna just said and add a slightly more optimistic slant to it, which is that you're totally right that that all the technology exists. Like, we have the capability to live in a basically environmentally friendly world, but we just haven't chosen to yet because conditions haven't really forced us to. Because like basically nobody ever wants to do a hard thing unless it's their last option. It's like we'd rather just stay comfortable and not do something hard unless we absolutely have to. And so I think, you're basically right that it seems like humanity is just giving it a few more years until conditions get hard enough that they're willing to sort of get out of bed and do the hard thing. But to me, that's in some ways a grounds for optimism, because it's like everything's there. We just have to choose to do it. And, so far we haven't chosen to yet, but that's the thing about a choice like that, is at any moment you can kind of wake up and be like, okay, it's game time. Here we go. And, we could start. And I mean, that's the part that I think I'm optimistic about.
Well, you're up. You're choosing. You wake up and you choose. I wake up and I choose. God knows it's not always easy to develop a project like this, but I still choose to continue to do that every day. Not only because I want to, but also because it has to be done. I think the group of people is growing. Just around me, I feel like there are people around me that are taking meaningful climate action. I am optimistic about all kinds of stuff that's happening, but I am pessimistic in the fact that we are on a delay. There's going to be a lot of lives that are going to be adversely affected by climate change in the coming years, unfortunately.
May I add one other closing thought, something I was thinking about earlier, hearing you talk about sustainable aviation fuel. Is like, I don't want to sort of conflate what you guys are doing with sustainable fuel and what the Honnold Foundation is trying to do philanthropically, because I think sustainable aviation fuel has the potential to basically change the world and like or drastically reduce global emissions in certain ways. And what we're doing philanthropically is a tiny, it's like a grain of sand on a beach of human need. Like, it's barely doing anything, though obviously it has an impact for the specific human communities. But I think the important distinction, though, is that even if something like sustainable aviation fuel changes the world, reduces emissions, sort of like greens aviation, and that's all great, the reality is that there are always people sort of left behind by these types of transitions. And I think that's where philanthropy fits in. And so I think that the projects that the Honnold Foundation are supporting are the types of projects that need to be funded no matter how many other gains are made in sustainability globally. Like as we see the world transition to renewables, as we see the world transition in a lot of different ways, you're like, that's amazing. And that's great for most humans on Earth. But there are still many who are just not benefiting from those kinds of changes at all. And I think that that's always going to be the realm of philanthropy that will remain important work in the foreseeable future.
And of course, all of this work we're talking about is still very early stage. I'm thinking about sustainable aviation fuels. Even if we were to put 100% e-SAF into planes, they would still be throwing a lot of bad stuff into the atmosphere when they fly. So we're really just starting to address the problem.
Yeah, but I think it's really important to note that when you're getting economies of scale in projects like this and you want to build a big project in order to reduce emissions from all flights taking off here in Iceland by 15%, once we have that facility up and running, it's not terribly challenging to increase hydrogen production. It's not terribly difficult to add on electrolyzer capacity. But it's that big client, it's Icelandair, it's Playa, it's Lufthansa. They're the ones that really would be paying for the build out of the big facility. But once that big facility is there, it actually makes it an option for construction companies to buy hydrogen equipment, for coach services to buy hydrogen coaches. It just becomes much, much easier to, at the societal level to piggyback off of a big commercial project. So yeah, I mean, I want to get this thing built. We're going, that's certainly why I wake up in the morning and do what I do. But I'm also optimistic that it will unlock energy transition options for the community that surrounds the project. So I'm hoping that it's the first step. I'm certainly not going to be retiring after I get this thing built. I'm going to be thinking about where I'm going to build the next one.
And that's a very inspiring thought to end on. This was a very robust discussion. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your exceptional experiences and knowledge in this field. I'm really glad we were able to have you both in the same room for this podcast. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank the Hilton Reykjavik Nordica for hosting this recording session today. And this was all possible thanks to our great team. On Thin Ice has original music by Nadir Kasim. Our script editor and editorial advisor is David Robert Vetter. And crucially, credit goes to our partners at the Bali Peak Outlook Foundation. The foundation is very serious about defending mountains around the world from the impact of climate change and excessive tourism. Check out their website to see what they're doing in the Himalayas, in the Alps, and other places. On Thin Ice is a production by Iceworm Media. We're just getting started, but we have many more great episodes coming up. Let us know what you think. Subscribe to our podcast feeds and our social media channels to get new episodes and bonus content. For now, goodbye.